Today I'm reading from Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete? We think about imprisonment as a fate reserved for others, a fate reserved for the evildoers, to use a term popularized by George Bush. Because of the persistent power of racism, criminals and evildoers are, in the collective imagination, fantasized as people of color. The prison, therefore, functions ideologically as an abstract site into which undesirables are deposited, relieving us of the responsibility of thinking about the real issues afflicting those communities from which prisoners are drawn in such disproportionate numbers. This is the ideological work that the prison performs. It relieves us of the responsibility of seriously engaging with the problems of our society, especially those produced by racism and increasingly global capitalism. What, for example, do we miss if we try to think about prison expansion without addressing larger economic developments? We live in an era of migrating corporations. In order to escape organized labor in this country and thus higher wages, benefits, and so on, corporations roam the world in search of nations providing cheap labor pools. This corporate migration thus leaves entire communities in shambles. Huge numbers of people lose jobs and prospects for future jobs. Because the economic base of these communities is destroyed, education and other surviving social services are profoundly affected. This process turns the men, women, and children who live in these damaged communities into perfect candidates for prison. In the meantime, corporations associated with the punishment industry reap profits from the system that manages prisoners and acquires a clear stake in the continued growth of prison populations. Put simply, this is the era of the prison industrial complex. The prison has become a black hole in which the detritus of contemporary capitalism is deposited. Mass imprisonment generates profits as it devours social wealth, and thus it tends to reproduce the very conditions that lead people to prison. There are thus real and often quite complicated connections between the deindustrialization of the economy, a process that reached its peak during the 1980s, and the rise of mass imprisonment, which also began to spiral during the Reagan-Bush era. However, the demand for more prisons was represented to the public in simplistic terms. More prisons were needed because there was more crime. Yet many scholars have demonstrated that by the time the prison constructing boom began, official crime statistics were already falling. Moreover, draconian drug laws were being enacted and 3 strikes provisions were on the agendas of many states. In order to understand the proliferation of prisons and the rise of the prison industrial complex, it might be helpful to think further about the reasons we so easily take prisons for granted. In California, as we have seen, almost 2/3 of existing prisons were opened during the 80s and 90s. Why was there no great outcry? Why was there such an obvious level of comfort with the prospect of many new prisons? A partial answer to this question has to do with the way we consume media images of the prison, even as the realities of imprisonment are hidden from almost all who have not had the misfortune of doing time. Cultural critic Gina Dent has pointed out that our sense of familiarity with the prison comes in part from representations of prisons in films and other visual media. Quote, "The history of visuality linked to the prison is also a main reinforcement of the institution of the prison as naturalized part of our social landscape. The history of film has always been wedded to the representation of incarceration. Thomas Edison's first films, dating back to the 1901 reenactment presented as newsreel, Execution of Chigol's, I'm probably mangling that, with Panorama of Auburn Prison, included footage of the darkest recesses of the prison. Thus, the prison is wedded to our experience of visuality, creating also a sense of its permanence as an institution. We also have a constant flow of Hollywood prison films, in fact, a genre. Some of the most well-known prison films are I Want to Live, Papillon, Cool Hand Luke, and Escape from Alcatraz. It also bears mentioning that television programming has become increasingly saturated with images of prisons. In recent documentaries, including the A&E series The Big House, which consists of programs on San Quentin, Alcatraz, Leavenworth, and Alderson Federal Reformatory for Women, the long-running HBO program Oz has managed to persuade many viewers that they know exactly what goes on in male maximum security prisons. But even those who do not consciously decide to watch a documentary or a dramatic program on the topic of prisons inevitably consumes prison images, whether they choose to or not, by the simple fact of watching movies or TV. It is virtually impossible to avoid consuming images of prison. In 1997, I was myself quite astonished to find, when I interviewed women in 3 Cuban prisons, that most of them narrated their prior awareness of prisons, that is, before they were actually incarcerated, as coming from the many Hollywood films they had seen. The prison is one of the most important features of our image environment. This has caused us to take the existence of prisons for granted. The prison has become a key ingredient of our common sense. It is there, all around us. We do not question whether it should exist. It has become so much a part of our lives that it requires a great feat of the imagination to envision life beyond the prison. Take care of yourselves. The fear cycle is meant to exhaust you, and it's meant to make you give up. Stay on task, keep helping people, keep forming community, keep having hard conversations, and take time for yourself. Do what you need to do to get your energy back up. This is a marathon, not a sprint. Take care of yourselves.